The conference hall in Washington, D.C. was packed. Rows of dignitaries, journalists, scholars, and clergy members filled the room, their voices humming in anticipation. The event had drawn an international audience, an interfaith symposium aiming to explore the role of belief in public leadership. But there was a peculiar buzz around this particular session. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was about to speak. As he approached the podium, the murmurs hushed into a respectful silence. Dressed in a dark suit, his expression was calm but intense, a man with the weight of legacy pressed upon his shoulders. The Kennedy name still echoed with reverence and tragedy in American consciousness. He looked around the room for a moment before he began. When my uncle, President John F. Kennedy stood before the American people, he spoke of a nation guided not just by policy, but by principle. And my father, Robert Kennedy, believed deeply in justice as a moral calling, not just a legal one. That legacy has haunted and inspired me every day of my life. The audience leaned in, drawn by the sincerity in his tone. But today I don't want to speak about politics, he continued. I want to speak about faith, not religion as an institution, but faith as a compass, a belief that something greater than ourselves should shape the way we govern, serve, and speak. He paused, eyes scanning the sea of faces. I've watched the nation I love drift, he said, drift into division, cynicism, and spiritual fatigue. We're no longer asking what's right. We're asking what's profitable, what's safe, what's popular. We've lost our reverence not just for God, but for each other. There was a stillness in the air, not from boredom, but weight. His words struck something raw. In my own journey, he continued, I've faced ridicule for holding on to values some call outdated. But I believe that the moral crisis we face isn't about left or right. It's about whether we believe anything at all, whether we stand for something that transcends the shifting winds of opinion. He took a deep breath, and for a moment it felt as though the room itself was holding its breath with him. This is not a speech for headlines. It's a plea that we remember the soul of this country, that we look to our traditions not as relics but as roots, that we speak once again the language of grace, duty, and sacrifice. Then he paused, slightly turning his head, eyes narrowing toward the back of the room. A movement had stirred behind the crowd. The heavy doors to the auditorium slowly opened, but no announcement followed. No security rush, only a slow procession. One man in white robes stepped forward without fanfare. Gasps and murmurs erupted, but quickly dissolved into silence. It couldn't be. Pope Leo XIV. He was not listed on the schedule. No public record indicated his presence in the United States. And yet there he stood, simple, unguarded, eyes solemn. Walking alone down the center aisle of a hall packed with power, Kennedy stepped back instinctively, stunned into silence. The Pope didn't look left or right. He simply approached, step by step, with the reverence of a man walking into sacred territory. The room was frozen. Before we go any further into this unforgettable moment, make sure to subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss what happens next. The Pope stopped at the foot of the stage, and then, without a word, he looked up. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. stood frozen, one hand still resting on the podium. His eyes met those of Pope Leo XIV, and for a long second, neither man moved nor spoke. The tension was thick, electric. No one in the hall dared whisper. The sound of the Pope's measured steps on the floor had been the last audible thing. The Pope, serene but grave, raised his hand slightly. It wasn't a gesture of power, but one of respect, a silent request. Kennedy stepped aside. The microphone stood between them like a gate. Leo XIV looked at it, then at Kennedy, who gave a small nod and stepped down without protest. No one offered the Pope a seat. He hadn't come to sit. The silence deepened as Leo XIV took a breath and began to speak. "This is not my stage," he said softly, yet his voice carried. "This is a place where truth was being spoken, and truth is sacred." A murmur tried to rise in the audience but quickly withered. His presence alone quieted dissent. He wasn't there to rebuke. He was there to affirm and to warn. "Today I heard a man remind us of our moral inheritance," the Pope continued. And I came because I fear the world no longer listens to such men. He turned to face the crowd directly. I did not come to preach. I came to ask a question. When did we stop fearing the silence of our own conscience? The words struck with a force greater than volume. People shifted in their seats, not from discomfort, but from a dawning awareness. I am not American, he continued, but I have watched this country. I have prayed for it, and I have wept for it. Not because it is sinful, it always was, but because it has forgotten how to repent. Kennedy stood a few feet away, hands clasped, watching. He had not expected this. No one had. The Church, Leo XIV said, turning slightly, is guilty too. We have failed when we should have spoken. We have protected institutions more than souls, but let no man believe that silence in the face of injustice is neutrality. It is complicity. The words were neither soft nor harsh. They were scalpel precise. He paused, then looked back at Kennedy. This man spoke of faith not as a tool, but as a burden. That is how it should be. Faith is not meant to comfort the powerful. It is meant to disturb them. A ripple of reaction ran through the room, emotional, not verbal. For many, it was the first time they had felt such naked truth spoken without apology. Leo XIV stepped slightly forward. I did not come to validate, he said. I came to witness. To confirm that when a man speaks truth with humility, even the halls of power must fall silent. He looked out again, as if seeing into each heart. We are all complicit in the moral decay we pretend to lament, but not all is lost. When a voice cries out, not in pride but in anguish, it is still holy ground. Then slowly, he stepped back from the microphone and turned to Kennedy. Speak, he said. Your voice was not finished. Kennedy hesitated, but then, moved by something deeper than shock, he stepped forward again. The podium felt different now, heavier. He looked at the crowd, now visibly transformed. There were no reporters scribbling, no flashes, only faces attentive and raw. I will speak, he said, his voice low, but I will speak now not as a politician. I will speak as a son, a believer, and a man who has been called out, not by greatness but by grace. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. stood before them again, not as a candidate, not as a speaker fulfilling a scheduled slot, but as a man interrupted and transformed. His voice, once deliberate, now trembled with sincerity. I was raised in a home where faith wasn't ornamental. It was woven into everything, how we treated others, how we viewed our duty, and how we understood pain. My grandfather carried a rosary in his pocket. My father prayed with us every night, even when the world seemed to crumble around him. He paused, letting the memory settle in the stillness. I don't pretend to have carried their mantle perfectly. I have stumbled, doubted, compromised when I shouldn't have, but I've never stopped believing that we are meant to be more than what we've become. From the back of the room, a quiet sob broke the silence. Kennedy didn't flinch. He pressed on, his voice steadier now. I have tried to speak for those unheard, to defend principles older than politics, and yet so often I've felt alone in that battle. Not politically, but spiritually. Pope Leo XIV remained at the side, arms folded, his gaze fixed not on Kennedy, but on the crowd, watching as though measuring the weight of each soul. Kennedy continued. I remember one night, not long ago, I had a dream. My father was sitting beside me the way he used to before speeches. He didn't speak. He just looked at me. And when I woke, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being asked a question. Have you forgotten who you are? He let the words settle, then added, and I had. The admission landed like thunder, not with noise, but with magnitude. Somewhere between ambition and survival, I began to believe that truth was negotiable, that conviction could be trimmed to fit a political window. But when I heard myself speak just now, and then saw His Holiness walk in, I knew I wasn't being allowed to hide anymore. People in the audience were openly weeping now, leaders, priests, skeptics. Something profound had ruptured the veneer of ceremony. Pope Leo XIV stepped forward again, not to speak, but to offer silent presence. Kennedy turned slightly toward him. We need faith, he said, not as branding, but as oxygen. Without it, we're not just politically broken, we're spiritually dead. The Pope raised his eyes to the crowd. There is no renewal, he said, his voice now joining again, without repentance. No progress without remembrance. We build walls to defend ideologies, but not altars to confess our guilt. His tone was mournful, yet unyielding. You speak of loneliness, Robert, he added, turning back to Kennedy. But loneliness is the shadow of conscience when it has not been answered. You are not alone now. There was no applause, no rush to affirm, just awe, the kind that anchors a soul in silence. Leo XIV began speaking, not just to Kennedy now, but to all. Every great fall begins with forgetfulness, not of law, but of God. We forget who made us. We forget that power is a loan, not a birthright, that leadership is service, not dominion. He scanned the faces. But sometimes all it takes is one voice to recall a nation. One honest voice. He turned his gaze again to Kennedy. Do not mistake your burden for a curse. It is your calling. Kennedy nodded, eyes full but resolute. And somewhere deep in the crowd, someone whispered, Amen. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. looked out at the crowd, eyes lingering on the sea of faces transformed by a collective awakening. Something had shifted, not in policy, not in strategy, but in spirit. I've spent years trying to navigate politics with integrity, he said quietly. But I've also spent years afraid that if I truly spoke what I believed, I'd be cast aside. That faith would be seen as weakness, and humility mistaken for naivety. He took a breath. But that fear, I now see, was the very thing silencing the truth I claimed to defend. He turned toward the Pope, then back to the crowd. I remember moments when I could have spoken out, when legislation stood against what I knew was just, and I stayed silent. Not because I didn't care, but because I convinced myself the battle would be better fought another day. His voice caught just briefly. But the truth doesn't wait. It doesn't negotiate. Pope Leo XIV stepped forward, speaking not as a figurehead, but as a shepherd. There is a difference, he said, between influence and conviction. The world may cheer for your causes, Robert, but heaven listens only for your truth. Kennedy nodded solemnly. I no longer want to be heard, he said. I want to be known by God, by history, by the generations that will ask what we did when the world stood on a knife's edge. He raised his eyes to the audience again. You came here for a symposium. You got a reckoning. There were no protesters, no walkouts, only an audience pulled into something larger than themselves, something ancient. The Pope lifted his hand and addressed them. This is not a revival of religion, it is a restoration of reverence. Politics cannot save a nation if the people themselves have surrendered their moral inheritance. He pointed gently outward, his gesture encompassing the entire hall. You look to your leaders, but forget your own responsibility. Faith is not a spectator sport. It is a fire. And either it consumes our apathy, or it dies. A murmur of realization spread. Soft prayers whispered, hands gripped tightly together. Leo XIV's eyes settled on a young woman in clerical robes, seated near the back. You, he said, will inherit what we fail to restore. If we choose convenience over courage, it will be your burden. He turned back to Kennedy. You have been given a platform not as reward but as trial. Will you use it to echo the noise, or to speak the silence everyone's afraid to face? Kennedy didn't answer immediately. He looked down for a moment, as if searching inward. Then, slowly, he said, I will speak the silence, even if it costs me everything. The words rang like a vow. The Pope gave a single nod. Then, as though sensing the hour had reached its peak, he addressed the crowd one final time. No man or woman here is exempt. You've been called, not to agreement, but to awakening. He lowered his hand. And when you leave this room, you will carry either fire or ashes. Choose carefully. Then came the silence again, not stunned, sacred. Kennedy placed his hand on his heart, overwhelmed not by pressure but by clarity. Around him, heads bowed, not in submission, but in solidarity. It was not a political moment. It was a spiritual one, and the room held its breath, suspended in truth. The hall remained hushed, the silence now tender rather than tense. Pope Leo XIV turned slowly, offering no final flourish, no grand dismissal. He simply placed a hand on Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s shoulder, firm, brief, and wordless. Whatever was spoken between them remained inaudible to all but Kennedy. Yet the look in his eyes said everything. There was no trace of pride, only reverence. As the Pope turned and walked away, the crowd instinctively parted, not out of obligation, but out of awe. No music played, no one resumed their notes. The moment was too delicate to break. Kennedy remained at the podium, still holding his heart. His voice, when he spoke again, was different, less projected, more prayerful. "I will never forget what happened here," he said, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was necessary. He looked slowly across the room. This wasn't about politics. This wasn't about position. It was about posture, the posture of the soul before truth. The audience remained silent, not from shock, but respect. A few nodded, others wiped tears, all visibly changed. Kennedy continued, his words unhurried. "I have spoken at countless events, none like this. Because today I was reminded that leadership isn't what we carry into a room, it's what we allow ourselves to carry out of it." He placed both hands on the podium now. "From this moment on, I am not asking for your votes. I am asking for your courage, your conscience, your willingness to be uncomfortable in the pursuit of what is right." He paused. "And if that means I lose the world's favor, but gain back my soul, I'll call that victory." The weight of his vow seemed to echo long after the words fell away. Slowly, the crowd began to rise, not to cheer, but in silent reverence. They stood together, a multitude drawn into a rare kind of unity. No movement followed, no photo lines, no autographs. The Pope had already exited. His absence spoke as loudly as his presence. In the days that followed, the story exploded across every platform. Clips went viral. Commentators debated the meaning. Faith leaders echoed the themes in their sermons. Politicians scrambled to respond, yet few could capture the essence. It wasn't the spectacle that moved the nation. It was the stillness, the moment where words gave way to weight. Kennedy's approval ratings rose, but more profoundly his tone changed. His speeches carried a deeper current. He spoke less like a man with a plan and more like one carrying a message. His campaign began using phrases like moral realignment and restoration of conscience. And people listened. Some dismissed it as political theater. But for those who were in that hall, or had watched with open hearts, something different had taken root. Years later, Kennedy would write in his memoir, "That day, I didn't feel empowered. I felt exposed. And for the first time, I was grateful for it." He would recount how the Pope's brief intervention changed the trajectory, not just of his campaign, but of his character. It wasn't a sermon. It was a summons, and it had echoed into lives well beyond that room. So if this story moved you, if something stirred in your heart as you listened, don't let it fade. Subscribe to the channel now, so you never miss a story that cuts deeper than the headlines. And if you're ready to continue this journey of truth, click the video on your screen right now. There's more to hear, more to feel, more to awaken, and the time is now.